Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take an in-depth look at the new 2020 Ritchey Outback, which has received some pretty significant updates from the previous version, both in terms of utility as well as geometry. Now as a company, Ritchey has always stood out to me as a pioneering brand who focuses on good solid design over bells and whistles. In my view, they don't always follow the trends in the cycling industry and instead strive to make the best possible bike for the intended purpose. Now the Outback here is Ritchey's all-road / gravel bike offering, and as with many of their frames, it uses Ritchey's own proprietary triple-butted steel tubing, famous for its strength and comfortable ride characteristics. Now over the past several weeks, I've logged some pretty decent miles on this bike, both on the road and off, so I hope you'll stick around to get my full take on this 2020 Ritchey Outback, including what I like and dislike about it, and who I think this bike is really designed for. If this is your first time here, this channel features reviews, how-tos, and nerdy deep dives into the world of cycling, all filtered through this extra average cyclist with a technical background. If you like this type of content, subscribing to the channel is the best way to show your support and to make sure you don't miss out on future videos like this. I think Ritchey is a company that really needs no introduction. The founder, Tom Ritchey, is somewhat of a legend and is largely considered to be the inventor of the modern mountain bike and has since pioneered several innovations in the cycling industry, including, among others, the compact multi-tool, the breakaway travel bike, and front and rear specific tire treads. Now, all of Ritchey's frame designs are informed by the needs of the cyclist and not the other way around, which is all too common these days. So it's no surprise that the new Outback here may look a little bit different than what the current trends in the industry depict. But after riding this bike for several weeks now, it's clear that the intentional design choices that went into this bike all work together to provide a super functional and capable all-road adventure bike. Now for starters, the frame is constructed from the famous Ritchey Steel tubing, which uses a triple-butted profile, meaning that the walls of the tubes are actually thicker near the joints where the stress concentrations are the highest, and then they gradually get thinner toward the midpoints to save weight and to improve comfort while riding. The frame also features a host of mounting options, including rack and fender mounts, as well as space for 3 bottle cages. Now up front, the bike gets Ritchey's all-new full-carbon adventure fork with 3 multi-use mounts per side, and each fork leg can support up to 3 kilograms. Now the interface between the frame and fork is actually interesting in that it uses a non-tapered headset, meaning that the upper and lower headset bearings are the same size. Now, while the current trend has mostly gravitated towards using a tapered headset with a larger lower bearing for added stiffness, the Outback intentionally incorporates a straight 1 1/8 steerer for increased compliance and comfort on the bike. Now altogether, the frame set can accommodate tires up to 700C by 48mm or 650B by 2 inches, but just looking at the frame and fork, I want to believe that these are pretty conservative numbers, and I would say that you can probably push those boundaries a bit if desired. Now I'm 5'8" or roughly 173 centimeters, so I've been riding a size small frame. This review bike came with a GRX 1x11 drivetrain with a Praxis carbon crank, a Ritchey Skyline saddle, along with a Ritchey WCS finishing kit, including the seat post, stem, and the appropriately spec'd Venture Max handlebars. It also came with alloy WCS Zeta wheels and Ritchey's own knobby gravel tires in 40mm, but I mostly rode the bike with a set of Hunt 35 carbon wheels with Panaracer Gravel King SKs set up tubeless, mostly because that's what I'm used to riding, and I wanted to feel the differences in frame material and geometry by eliminating as many variables as possible. Now the weight of the bike in a size small in this configuration with no pedals or bags or accessories is a very respectable 20.3 pounds or 9.2 kilograms, but honestly my guess is that potential buyers of this bike could probably care less. Now in general, I'd say the bike could be described as having a classical design with modern accommodations. For instance, you get your traditional external cable routing for simplicity and ease of maintenance, but you get through axles to suit modern wheel sets. You get a skinny head tube for added compliance and a classic look, but the frame set also accommodates modern flat mount disc calipers. You get a traditional hassle-free, creak-free 68mm threaded bottom bracket, but you also get modern gravel geometry with a relatively slack 70-degree head tube angle. It's just really an interesting bike, and on paper it clearly goes against the grain on where most current trends are headed. For instance, one of the first things that jumps out at you are the extended chainstays. At 453mm, they're 20 to 30mm longer than the typical all-road bike and are creeping up to touring bike standards. Now the design intent here is to cater to riders who value stability over agility, and it really starts to make sense when you think about how this bike is likely to be used. In other words, the longer chainstays and consequently the longer wheelbase, paired with the slacker head tube angle, is going to favor the cyclist who wants to go adventuring on long, steady rides and be rewarded on the descents with a fun, stable bike that can handle just about anything. Now, the longer chainstays out back also increase the heel clearance for cyclists who like to throw panniers on their bike and not have their feet scrape against the bags. In contrast, the popular short, tucked chainstay trend certainly rewards the powerful sprinter who likes to really throw the bike around side to side, but then again, in my opinion, that's not really who this Outback is designed for. So how does the bike actually ride? Well, I'll try and break this discussion down into off-road and on-road categories since the experience is very different on both. And I'll start with the off-road experience since that's where I feel this bike really shines. Now, I've taken this bike on a variety of off-road stuff from well-groomed hard-packed dirt trails to some moderately steep, chunky, and rutted stuff. And it's here where things get kind of sketchy where the Outback really showcases its strengths. Now, I think a combination of the longer wheelbase and the higher trail figure up front really gives a rider a sense of confidence when descending. The bike is super stable and surprisingly comfortable over really rough terrain. Now, from the first big off-road descent I went down, I never had the sense that I had to be too careful with my line choice, as the bike just kind of plowed through the chunk and pretty much went wherever I pointed it. Now, this is in contrast to a shorter wheel-based, steeper head angle geometry, which is certainly more nimble, but can also feel a bit out of control when the going gets really rough. Now, I think while the stable handling characteristics on off-road stuff can generally be attributed to the geometry, there's also something to be said about the comfort and smoothness of the bike. Now, I truly believe that this is the first steel bike that I've ever ridden where I can confidently say like, oh, this is what a steel frame is supposed to feel like. Now, I believe that the use of the butted tubing is really what allows the bike to be so comfortable and lightweight. And it's certainly not a bike that conforms to the stiffer is better mantra. In fact, I'd say that it flat out contradicts this idea by building compliance directly into the frame. Now, it's not so flexy that you can feel it while pedaling and you feel like you're losing efficiency, but it's got enough give so that the relentless sort of high frequency rumble of your typical dirt or gravel trail is substantially muted. And you can feel it most after a long ride, where on a stiffer frame you might feel more fatigued and beat up by the terrain. Now, the 2020 Outback, I would say, just strikes a great balance between stiffness and compliance, and again, I think it's a testament to great design. Now, on the road, I would say that the Outback favors long, steady efforts over shorter sprints, which is not to say that the bike is boring on the road by any means. Now, from my experience, the bike actually carries speed really well, and the same comfort that you experience out on the trails also translates to a really smooth ride out on the road. And when you think of road cycling, typically you imagine motoring along on perfectly smooth tarmac, but for the average cyclist, a road ride usually consists of at least some pretty chunky roads and beaten up sections of asphalt. Now, in this case, again, the Outback really steps up by absorbing a lot of that high frequency chatter that's just so fatiguing over a long ride. And then the issue of the stretched out and slackened geometry could be seen as a drawback on the road, as a bike will certainly not be as nimble or as agile as a proper race bike. But then again, for the potential buyer of the Outback, so what? A nimble and agile bike isn't in and of itself any more fun by any means. Rather, I sense that these adjectives tend to be falsely associated with speed and efficiency, when in reality, the only cyclists who really benefit from a nimble and agile geometry are mostly the true roadies who ride a lot in tight packs and need to be able to quickly react to other nearby cyclists, either to avoid contact with other riders or to respond to attacks and try to hold the wheel. Now, personally, 90% of all my drop bar bike adventures are solo rides, and the 10% of group rides that I do go on are generally with like-minded cyclists who aren't really concerned with pretending to be in the pro peloton. Now, all of this to say, while the Outback isn't designed to perform and handle like a sports car, it certainly holds its own out on the road, and it rewards the steady cyclist who values comfort over agility. So is there anything I don't like about the bike? Well, I would say that the long chainstays probably aren't for everyone. I wouldn't call it a dislike, but it's definitely a consideration. Now, maybe I'm just in the majority of average cyclists who have been groomed to believe that short, tucked chainstays are better for whatever reason. But the longer stays on the Outback do seem to mellow out the handling, but not really in a negative way. Again, the bike isn't super lively on hard efforts on smooth tarmac, but in return, you get that extra confidence when flying down chunky trails. Now again, this all kind of makes sense when you consider what the bike's design intent really is. Now the other thing which is pretty minor is the rather strange rear shift cable routing. Now this section of exposed inner cable harkens back to simpler times when you'd see 2 or 3 parallel brake and shift cables running along the bottom of the top tube with those little rubber cable donuts. Now I would say that modern shifting has gotten so good that there's really no reason not to run full housing all the way back. And if you did that, you could run the housing under the top tube and not interfere with running a frame bag. And regarding the position, I thought about it for a while. If they had gone underneath the top tube with the exposed cable, then frame bags are kind of out of the question. And I really feel like this is the type of bike that you'd almost always want to run a frame bag with. Now they could have gone under the down tube, but then there would be 3 cables all running down there if you're running a 2x system, and there'd be no real good way to run them symmetrically and still have space for that 3rd water bottle cage underneath. Now, I suppose they could have run it along the side of the top tube to leave space for a top tube bag and a frame bag, but that would be kind of awkward, and it would also cover up the Outback branding, so I kind of get what they did here. And really, aside from being a bit aesthetically strange, it doesn't actually interfere with running a frame bag at all. I ran one the entire time I had this bike just by running the straps underneath the rear shift cable. Now if it really bugs you, I'd say the easiest fix is probably just to run full housing under the top tube and call it a day. So who is this bike for? Well, I would argue that the redesigned 2020 Ritchey Outback is for average cyclists who want a true one-bike stable that can handle road, dirt, gravel, and whatever else you throw at it. And the geometry strikes a good balance that suits both on and off-road riding equally, unlike the modern trend which seems to be to bias the geometry toward road efficiency and then claim it can handle a bunch of off-road stuff just by adding wider tires. Now the Outback is durable and very comfortable with the steel construction, and it's got functional features like threaded bottom bracket, external cable routing, and plenty of mounting options. And it also has modernized geometry to offer, again, what I would say is a great balance for riders who like to spend equal time on-road and off. Now the Outback is probably not for the cyclist who is super concerned about quick handling and racy geometry. Rather, it caters to the cyclist who is more concerned with miles per mile rather than miles per hour. It's really versatile with accommodations for bike packing and perhaps some touring, but also when stripped down of bags, it's a fantastic bike just for a long mixed terrain ride. Now regarding the weight, it's surprisingly light for a steel bike, and I think that a bike like this with very strategic butting built into the design really challenges some of the older notions of the heavy, sort of overbuilt steel frame. Now I would say that the owner of the Outback is probably interested in riding some off-road stuff, but also want a bike that behaves well enough on the road. Now, as opposed to, say, a hardtail mountain bike, the Outback is really a bike you can ride from home, knock down a handful of paved miles to get out to the fun off-road stuff, rip around in the dirt for a while, and then ride it back home. In other words, there's no need to drive to the trailhead if your local trails are within a reasonable distance. Now, it certainly shines in the chunkier off-road stuff, but it's pleasantly efficient on the road as well. And I would say that depending on the build kit and wheel tire combination you choose, you can bias it more towards road or gravel pretty easily. So is this a bike that I would buy? Honestly, probably yes, if I had the space and money for it. If I were to buy this bike, I would probably build it with 650B wheels and high volume tires and run a 1x mullet drivetrain and have it really be biased toward off-road terrain, but not so much that I would dread the road ride to get out to the trails. Okay, so I think that's going to do it for this one. This bike has been a blast to ride, and I've really got a renewed sense for how a proper steel bike should or could feel. And for me, it's done away with many of the stigmas associated with older, heavier steel bikes. Now, I'd love to hear what you think about the new 2020 Ritchey Outback down in the comments, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have about my experience on the bike over the past several weeks. Anyways, thanks for watching, and thanks for subscribing if you haven't already, and I will see you next time.